Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. California serves 6 million K-12 students, spending $61 billion in state dollars and $36 billion in local dollars annually to operate those schools. Together, that's almost $100 billion a year for education. It's now, in fact, at record highs. Last year, it was $22,000 per student. This year, it's going to be about $21,000 per student. Has it had the intended effect of improving student scores? Our guest is Julien Lafortune, who is a research fellow at the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California, and he specializes in K-12 education. He recently authored a report entitled Understanding the Effects of School Funding. Pretty timely. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
So let's go over a brief history of school funding in California. Give us the highlights.
Yeah, so for most of California's history, funding was local, coming through local property taxes. Over time, districts would get additional state and federal dollars. But the thing was that the system led to a lot of inequities and disparities in education funding, greater funding in places with more local property wealth that could afford to fund their schools at higher rates. So in 1971, the state Supreme Court found the system unconstitutional in what's called the Serrano case, and the state switched to a system that was called the revenue limit system, which basically equalized funding across districts. Prop 13 came around about 7 years later and capped local property tax rates. And so what we were left with was a system for several decades that basically had more equality across districts, but was also more reliant on state funding.
So that's just a point there. He who has the gold makes the rules. So when you shift the funding from local to state, now the state's starting to set the rules. So then we move forward and we have Prop 98.
Yeah, so then we have Prop 98, which guarantees a certain part of the state budget going towards education. And then kind of on top of this system, the state layered a lot of state-funded initiatives that are called categorical programs. And so these basically put further restrictions on how districts could spend money, but were targeted towards specific needs. And so by 2013-14, there were a lot of these categorical programs, and we had a big shift in this funding formula. So we had the local control funding formula, which essentially did 2 things. One, it removed a lot of these categoricals, giving districts flexibility. And the second is that it gave more funding to high-need students in high-need districts under what's called a weighted funding formula. So it's a bit of flexibility while also kind of giving more funding to districts for their high-need students.
And certainly those districts with high-need students really like this. And more flexibility, more funding. Who would say no to that? But here's a question. The assumption here is that money matters. Does it?
So the short answer, at least when it comes to the research consensus, is yes. But this wasn't always the research consensus. So if you kind of go back several decades to 1966, there was a pretty important report that the federal government put out that's often referred to as the Coleman Report that studied differences in spending and family resources and inputs and outputs at schools, and generally concluded that there wasn't much of an influence of resources beyond family background. And so kind of over the subsequent decade, a lot of research was colored by this and really found mixed and inconclusive evidence. And there were particularly many that argued that additional funding, at least without any sort of accountability or incentives, wouldn't really deliver improved outcomes in and of itself.
So, understanding from your report, you're saying that research shows that higher spending does lead to improved student outcomes, and that's now focusing state level finance reforms. What do the studies generally tell us in that area?
So what ended up happening is, even though there was not much of a research consensus, there were a lot of state level finance reforms that went out and continued to, direct more money to low income students. And so we have a lot of good research now on these reforms using better methods and better data in more recent decades that found, kind of like California did in the 1970s, these efforts that directed a lot of funding to equalize and really improve funding in low income places and school districts led to improvements in test scores, graduation rates, college attendance, and even on some studies that can make these data linkages, higher earnings later in life and adulthood.
So then we have the local control funding formula you were talking about earlier in 2013-14. Big change in the way schools are financed. More funding for school districts with low income and high need students. Has it generally improved student outcomes?
So that's what we were starting to see in the data, at least before the pandemic. So we had some indications that the additional funding that's really targeted towards low-income students and was given, in fairly unrestricted ways. So districts had a lot of flexibility. It looked like that was improving outcomes and to some extent was lessening gaps, right? So LCFF, I mentioned, came out in 2013. It wasn't really until 5 years later that was fully funded. And so these impacts kind of took time to accumulate. And so when we look just before the pandemic in the 2018-19 school years, that's really what we found, kind of improvements in high school graduation rates and test scores, and specifically improvements in those highest need districts that are getting most of the additional funding.
Okay, so up next, we're going to talk about some of the specifics. Does it matter what the school funding is spent on? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking about K-12 funding and whether money matters. The short answer appears to be yes, but, and that's according to our guest, Julien Lafortune, who's a research fellow with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California, and he's an expert who specializes in K-12 education. You note in your report that, quote, positive effects are generally larger for operational spending than for capital spending, unquote. Can you elaborate, and what are the key takeaways for policymakers?
So a lot of times we like to split school spending into two big buckets: operational day-to-day spending like staff salaries, benefits, materials, and then things like capital spending on renovations and infrastructure. And so in the research, we have a lot more consistent evidence for positive returns to the operational spending, but it's more mixed when it comes to capital. And so it looks like there's a larger, per dollar impact from operational spending. So what does this mean for policy? Well, there's kind of two things, right? In general, we have this more consistent return to spending on staff. But second, we also have some evidence that the returns to capital spending can be more variable, right? So it might be about targeting the places that have aging facilities could be a better use of funds than, say, targeting funding towards places that already have nice facilities, but say want to improve them further.
Yeah, it seems to make sense, right? Like local control funding formula, spending more dollars in high need districts, it just seems logical sense that's probably should increase scores. The question is, what does the data show?
So that's exactly what it shows. And when we look specifically at kind of low-income students and districts, we find that the impacts are larger for test scores, graduation, even adult earnings impacts when we look at other studies nationally, looking at the low-income populations. And so if we actually average across all national studies, kind of the per dollar impacts are about twice as large for low-income students. And a lot of studies that look at both tend to find impacts that are much larger within their samples for low-income than, say, higher-income students.
Yeah, and the idea here too is if they're doing better when they graduate, there's a return on investment. In other words, the state is spending a lot of money on this. The question is there a return on investment? I hear what you're saying, but there is a return on investment for those lower income or high need students by having more money focused on their education. And ask you something about operational spending. That's the money we're talking about for teachers in classrooms, having a greater impact than capital spending. We're talking about money spent on construction, renovation of school facilities. You're not saying we shouldn't spend money on capital projects, are you?
No, and what I was trying to get at earlier was that, it could be that these impacts on capital, and it looks like at least they're more variable and context dependent. And there are places that get huge returns, right? In some places with aging and dilapidated facilities, it looks like we have larger per dollar impacts there. But what's kind of interesting in terms of the way we fund is that we actually spend and fund more on capital in places that have higher incomes and better facilities to begin with. So it's important to note that the research here is less positive, but there's also not as much research on this, in part because it's just easier to study changes in teachers and things that happen more frequently than it is to study, big long-term changes like building a new school building, which is much more infrequent.
Yeah, I know that Fresno Unified, for example, spent a lot of money renovating some of their older high schools. Did a very nice job, but they spent a lot of money, obviously believing that money was well spent because the physical environment does impact, education to some extent, particularly in those buildings that were a little bit older and needed rehabilitation. So what should policymakers take from all of this?
Well, I think there's two things. Research telling us about average impacts of spending policies. They're not necessarily one size fits all solutions. So I think we do need to recognize there's not necessarily a settled answer on what the best way to spend is, and maybe the best varies a lot by district circumstances and local conditions. But second, I also think a lot of the studies that we have can look, try to look at quantifiable measures, test scores, graduation, but things like, say, athletic facilities, playgrounds, even HVAC, or investments in student health and social emotional well-being. These all may have indirect impacts on academics, but their impacts probably go far beyond academics. And so if we're only measuring the academic impacts, we're perhaps missing a lot of the other potential impacts. And so that's a caveat, I think, with this research that policymakers need to keep in mind, especially for types of spending that go beyond the traditional uses that schools have.
Yeah, I mean, but you also think, though, going back to capital projects, air conditioning. In the Valley, I'm sure if you have a school where the air conditioning is not working, I don't know how a student can study in that environment. So I think that capital outlay would probably have a pretty good return on investment for students.
Yeah, and we do actually have research on that, specifically on air conditioning and more generally investments in facilities that are, kind of inadequate at a very basic level. And so, a way to characterize the research on buildings and capital is that we have strong evidence of academic effects from very, kind of important baseline fundamental investments, you could say, like air conditioning. But things get more mixed and maybe aren't showing up in terms of test scores when we look at stuff like athletic facilities or performance art centers that parents, students, teachers, the community may still value, but probably aren't going to show up at least right away in kind of math and English test scores.
That's very interesting, because I think you might have hit, I don't want to say the third rail of investment or spending, but I'm sure that's very important to a lot of families, spending on athletic facilities and performing arts centers. But we've been talking generally about national studies. What about California specific research? Are there any important insights for state and local policymakers that can be taken from that California research? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. The adoption of the local control funding formula, California's landmark overhaul about a decade ago, significantly changed the way local school districts are funded. The goal was to improve student outcomes in high-need school districts. The question is, did it work? We're talking with Julien Lafortune. He's an education policy expert with the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California. So, one of the things you mentioned in your report is that there was another attempt at targeted funding several years ago, back in 1996, actually. This K-3 class size reduction reform cost about $1 billion a year. You said it had kind of mixed results. What happened there?
So this class size reduction policy in the mid-90s is an example of really a policy that had good intentions, but had complications when we brought it to scale. And so the state gave funding to reduce class sizes, but they didn't have a ready and waiting supply of teachers that could immediately fill these jobs. So what did districts have to do? They had to rely on more novice teachers. They had to rely on teachers without full credentials. Schools had to compete against each other for a limited supply of teachers. So on aggregate, we didn't see much of an impact on test scores. And when we dug into the research later, and others have dug into this, they found that actually there were gains from the smaller classes themselves, but they tended to be offset by the fact that these classes had to rely on less experienced, more novice, and less credentialed teachers.
Yeah, you said in your report that this K-3 class size issue, quote, exemplifies why large-scale spending increases may not immediately yield benefits, unquote. And you note that, quote, similar pattern emerged with LCFF, local control funding formula. Can you explain?
Yeah, so in the class size reduction policy, these novice teachers eventually become experienced. And so we might think that there were larger long-run impacts than the short-run impacts that were studied. Under LCFF, perhaps this thing has gone on to a lesser extent. Some of the funds, but not all of them, went towards increasing, the quantity of teachers, lowering class sizes. So by the same logic, we might see delays in when the impacts actually show up. And that's kind of what we've seen so far. And I think these types of dynamics are why education researchers tend to think that spending impacts operate at a lag. You have to hire new staff, you have to change policies, but that impact won't happen right away. The dollars, turning into kind of improved student outcomes takes some time to matriculate.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned in your report, that's an area of fruitful study. I mean, what is the lag effect? Because they are hiring, there's this demand for teachers, so you're hiring a lot of novice teachers. Initially, they're not as efficient and effective as they will when they have more experience, and then the results really kind of kick in. But let's talk about the results for the LCFF policy. What's been the impact of additional spending on student outcomes generally, and has it helped close that achievement gap that they're trying to close between low and high income students specifically?
So when we look just in general at the impact of additional spending, we see modest improvements across the board. And when we look specifically At achievement gaps, we do see some measure, some improvement there, right? So across the board, improvements in test scores, improvements in graduation, improvements in college readiness. When we look specifically, at achievement gaps, there's a bit of a mixed picture depending on whether we measure it based at the district level compared to the student level. So if we compare high need versus low need districts, we see a modest reduction in the gaps, but these are much smaller when we look specifically at student level gaps, in part because we're targeting funds to districts, but maybe not necessarily to the student, the highest need students themselves.
Yeah, it's one of the things you hear sometimes from school administrators is, well, I might be a high income district, but I have some low income schools, and we're not benefiting from LCFF like other ones are, and so that becomes an issue. So where does this leave policymakers? Was LCFF, it was a pretty big sea change in the way schools are funded. Good idea, bad idea, needs to be modified? What?
I think the research tends to show that it's working to improve outcomes. It's working to target funds in general to higher need students in the state. We know from other research that's kind of where we have the biggest bang for our buck. So I think in general that it's working well, and policymakers can be kind of pleased with that state of the of progress. But a more subtle aspect is that, again, this kind of targeting that aspect that you mentioned. Some districts have a lot of high need students that don't get a ton of additional funding. Some districts have very, very high need schools and don't get funded the same way for them. And so it matters, how these funds are targeting districts, and it also matters how districts are spending on different schools and students within their district. And we don't, unfortunately, have a lot of data to monitor that.
Yeah, because you have to know exactly where that money is being spent. Is it being spent on those high need students, which was the original intent? You may or may not have that kind of granular knowledge sometimes. So here's the question: should we stay the course, or should we change the course? We're going to have that conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Julien Lafortune. He is an educational policy expert with the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California about the impact of education dollars on education, student outcomes. So California, is using this local control funding formula for the last decade to give more money to school districts with more high need students, with the goal of closing that achievement gap between high need students and low need students. The question is, should we stay the course with this? How much more funding is it going to take over how much longer a period of time to really close that achievement gap? Because that was the focus of the LCFF.
Yeah, exactly. In our report, we do a bit of a back of the envelope calculation. So not exactly a prediction per se, but more a calculation to try to get a sense of, okay, what does the research imply for California's current spending levels and given the wide achievement gaps that we see? So right now we spend about $800 more per low income student than non-low income student on average. And given what the research finds on the impact of an additional dollar and the size of the achievement gaps that we have in California by income, we're really only at about a tenth of the amount that would be required to close in, say, 8 years, right? A student's kind of trajectory up through 8th grade. Put differently, if we kind of flip that on its head, the difference in spending that we're at kind of implies it would take us 70 years to close the gap. And that's if we just kind of assume, the dollar is working on average the way it has across other states and settings.
Wow. So the question, I guess it begs the question, does this mean that spending more money or this policy is an ineffective or inefficient way to close the achievement gap?
No, not exactly. And I think that's a key point for policy. It's not that the policies are ineffective or even that they're inefficient, right? The research is finding that there's consistent positive impacts. It tends to find that they pass a cost benefit analysis. And it tends to show that, spending on low income students provides even better kind of return on our dollar, return on our investment. But what it really does show is that even though we have these policies, when we actually add it up, we have such large magnitude of achievement gaps, of inequities that we face in the education system. So, even doing something that has a modest or even a significant impact really only chips away at part of the gap that exists. And so we're kind of far from the level that would really take us all the way, if finance is really the only vehicle that we, attempt to do that through.
Yeah, California is a huge state, a very diverse population, and so these needs are rather great. You conclude in your report that, quote, how spending is targeted matters for students and districts. Can you elaborate?
So there's a lot of ways targeting can matter. I think there's two big ones that we talk about in the report. And so first, it matters how funding is targeted to students. So we give districts extra funding to support their high need students. Do they spend it on the high need students at the high need school sites? In a district where all of the kids are high need or low income, it doesn't really matter. But in districts that are more in the middle, matter how well that they target these funds. And so we really want them spending more, on these students within districts. We don't have good data to assess that. And now second, the other aspect of targeting that matters is when we spend on staff, are we spending on, say, teacher quantity and hiring new teachers and reducing class size, or are we spending, say, on teacher quality? A dollar can mean different things in those two dimensions. And a lot of schools, especially low-income schools, tend to rely on the quantity approach. We have a lot of teachers, but they're often very novice, whereas more affluent schools tend to rely on the opposite. We have fewer teachers, but they're higher paid, they're more experienced, they have more credentials. Those can end up being the same, that can look like on a balance sheet, the same type of dollar being spent, but in reality, it means very different things for a student.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, where to spend those dollars, with the more experience or with the novice. But the novice teachers, as we mentioned earlier, over time, they do get experience. And so you would expect them to have an impact. This last question I have, we have about a minute and a half left, but I want to ask you this, while we're spending has grown, per student spending has grown, so have other costs. There's other cost pressures in school districts. What are some of those pressures and what's the impact?
So there's a lot of pressure. Spending's growing, but district dollars are also getting stretched further. And so just like households are with this bout of inflation, in the education setting, really, we've had these pressures for a lot longer. And so healthcare costs are one of the big ones that's been rising faster than inflation for many, many years. And also at the state level, and this is due to a policy change, about a decade ago, districts now have to contribute about twice as much to their employee pension plans than they did a decade ago, which crowds out resources on
a very significant hit to school districts.
Absolutely. And so they're spending more on benefits. They're spending more on healthcare costs. We have labor shortages right now, especially in key subject areas. And so even when we can have the additional funding to spend, it can be difficult for districts to actually use that.
Yeah. And the other issue is that you're reading about is declining enrollments and what that means, because they're being paid on a per student basis. So that's also an issue, isn't it?
Exactly. Longer term, we face this issue that even though we kind of have higher per student amounts, fewer students in the system means that there needs to be some sort of downsizing. And it's not always efficient to downsize. And that can involve a lot of difficult decisions, like even closing schools or eliminating programs that are popular with parents.
Well, there's lots out there. I want to thank Julien Lafortune with the Public Policy Institute of California for joining us. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thank you for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.